Welcome back to Understanding the Bible Online. In this session, we'll be continuing with our study of the Gospel of Mark. Now, we just wrapped up Mark chapter 1, in which we saw the beginning of Jesus' ministry. It was popular and grew quickly. Verse 127 says, and they were all amazed. And verse 28 declares his fame spread everywhere. Verse 32 says we see that all who were gathered at the door that were sick, Jesus healed them, healed many with various diseases, and he cast out demons. Furthermore, verse 37 says, everyone is looking for you. His tour in verse 39 proclaims he went through all of Galilee, and verse 45 explains that Jesus couldn't openly enter a town, and people were coming to him from every quarter. It just keeps getting more crowded. Now here, as we move into Mark chapter 2, verse 2 tells us that there was no room for him, not even at the door. The popularity reaches its peak in verse 12, where the words are proclaimed, we've never seen anything like this. Seen, enter the Pharisees. Jesus has just proclaimed something huge. He says in Mark chapter 2, verse 10, but I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. This statement is confirming that he is God. Now, in our journey through Mark's presentation of Jesus as the servant, and the text we're covering today, the servant is opposed. Stemming from this major proclamation of Jesus' ability to forgive sins, the Pharisees are unable to accept him, and they begin looking for opportunities to accuse him. Now, their accusations come sure and fast. He's eating with sinners. His disciples are not fasting. They accuse him of breaking the law and being possessed by the prince of demons. How does Jesus respond to this? Through parables. About a third of the teaching of Jesus is in this style of teaching. Parables were to instruct disciples of Christ without revealing truths to those on the outside. Parables test the spiritual responsiveness of those who hear them. So, while Jesus' accusers were present, they were spiritually unable to understand that which he was revealing. Jesus continues in ministry, imparting to those who have ears to hear. Now, one parable we find in this text is that of the mustard seed. Though this seed is one of the smallest seeds and is an herb, the Palestinian mustard plant grows up to the height of 10 to 12 feet. It pictures the phenomenally rapid spread of Christianity from a small beginning. Now, the occupying force of the land at the time was the Roman Empire, and the Roman troops were a force to be reckoned with. They captured and or destroyed their enemies at will. There was no stopping them, and yet they feared four things that could stop them. Okay, number one, bad weather on the sea or land. Number two, evil spiritual forces. Number three, sickness that would make someone unable to defend themselves. And then number four, death. The Roman Empire was afraid of bad weather, evil spiritual forces, sickness, and death. Okay, with that in mind, let's talk about an amazing story that happens about 23 months into Jesus' 40-month ministry. It starts with Jesus calming the sea in Mark 4. Violent storms often occurred on the Sea of Galilee because the valleys descended to the lake some 700 feet below sea level, and then it acted like a wind tunnel, like waves would get bad quickly and a boat would be in great danger. So in verse 39, Jesus tells the wind to be still, and it obeys. Jesus has power over bad weather on the sea or the land. Okay, cool story, but it's not over yet. After that, we read in Mark 5 of a man possessed by a legion of demons. Could be as many as 6,000 demons living in his body. No chain can bind him. Everyone stayed away from him. Enter Jesus. Jesus sent all the demons, cast them out into a large herd of pigs. The pigs ran down into a steep bank and they drowned. The man was completely healed. Jesus has power over all evil spiritual forces. Incredible story, but it's not over yet. After that, we read in Mark 5 about a lady who had a bleeding problem that had been going on for 12 years. She decided to touch Jesus. If only I can touch him, I'll be made whole. She said, well, she did, and she was made whole. Jesus has power over all sickness. Awesome story, but it's not over yet. In Mark 5, we read about a man named Jairus who had a 12-year-old daughter that was close to death. Jesus goes with him to see about her, but by the time he arrives, she's died. Jesus says she's only sleeping and raises her from the dead. Jesus has power over death. Okay, remember what the Roman Empire was afraid of: bad weather, evil spiritual forces, sickness, and death. Mark includes the 4 miracles we just talked about in his presentation of Jesus to the Romans to answer these 4 fears. So good. Okay, lastly, we see that not everyone wanted to accept Jesus. In Mark 6, we find out that Jesus did not have a home court advantage. His hometown believed he was only a carpenter. They took offense at Jesus. They gave him no honor, and Jesus could do only a few healings. They were people who lacked faith in him. And then we see in Mark chapter 7 that the Pharisees couldn't see past their own tradition. The Pharisees and teachers of the law spoke on several traditions of the elders. Wash your hands before you eat, and wash your cups and pitchers and kettles before you eat. Now, these traditions were mammoth in Israel's way of religious life. They became too focused on the traditions instead of the meaning and the revelation behind them. Jesus replied that nothing from outside a man can make him unclean. It is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean. Things like evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. Lastly, the Pharisees did not want to accept Jesus without a sign. Mark 8:11 tells us they wanted a miraculous sign from heaven, but Jesus told them no sign would be given. In verse 15, we see Jesus tell them to be careful. He speaks of being cautious, of following the voices of the time. That the Pharisees' yeast was hypocrisy and Herod's yeast was secularism and worldliness. So what do we see in all this? Jesus, the servant, was largely accepted as long as he was providing the things people wanted. But when he began proclaiming the reason that he was here, which was to reconcile man back to God, opposition quickly began. Even today, people may easily accept the existence of God, but will deny Jesus Christ as the one through whom reconciliation is made. Narrow is the way, as Scripture tells us, and there are few who find it. So we must be careful not to oppose the movement of God, but to remain tender and responsive to his message.